and elementary grades. Before we get started, here's just a few webinar norms that we're going to talk about. At the top of your screen, there is a toolbar. You'll notice there's a chat button. You'll want to have that menu open because throughout the presentation, I will ask you to drop things in the chat, and that's also where links are going to be located. So it's a good thing to have open. You can also raise your hand if you have any questions. There's a reactions button that will give you a menu of options you can select from, and that will sort of pop up on your screen where I can see it. We're going to be using that today in some quick poll type activities. And then there's also your camera and microphone buttons. I'm going to ask that you keep yourself muted until you're prompted, and when you're prompted, you may come off mute and speak to the group. Again, I really appreciate all of y'all being here today. So before we get started, I wanted to include a question that I got from one of the last times that I did a PD like this. And that question is, this is from a teacher. This is a real comment that I received, asking how they can incorporate more technology or diverse or engaging activities for younger kids. And this is one of our big whys for today, as far as why we're talking about primary and secondary source use. And the answer to that question is source-based activities is a great way to incorporate and engage younger kids. You don't have to read all of these. This is just a sampling of different types of activities you can do in just 15 minutes. In my statewide survey that I sent out to elementary social studies teachers earlier this year, one of the biggest challenges that they talked about was the limited time that they sometimes have to teach social studies. So one of the biggest ways that you can get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, with your time is to use primary sources and engage with the historical thinking skills. And all of these activities listed can incorporate primary and secondary sources into your instruction. And you're really only limited by your time and your creativity is what I like to tell people. The sky is the limit. So as we get started today, Brent is going to drop a link in the chat. I would like you to click that link and it's going to open a Google Doc. And I would like you to write your initials next to the statements that match you. So we just kind of want to see where everybody's at, how familiar you are with these things, and then we will get into the presentation. All right, so we're going to come back together now. Thank y'all so much for that. That kind of gives me an idea of y'all's experience and where you're at, what you're comfortable with. So we're going to start with the very, very basics today, and the reason why is going to be very clear. Most of you are very familiar with primary and secondary sources, but the first thing we want to do is very clearly define what those are. So primary sources are described as the raw materials of history. They are things that were created at the time under study. They are things like government documents, paintings, letters, diaries, photos, so on and so forth. And here are just a few examples of a few different types. Of course, you got your photographs, you've got your government documents. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. It doesn't show up very well. A World War I poster and a painting of George Washington. Now, the reason that I'm including this particular painting of George Washington is because paintings can be primary sources if the person sat in front of it or if somebody was witnessing the event and creating that art at the time. So when we move to secondary sources, they are accounts that retell, analyze, or interpret events at a distance of time or place. That distance of time or place is key because even though something might be from the same time period, if we're studying the American Revolution and a source was made in Germany, that's going to be a secondary source instead of a primary source. Things like textbooks, interpretive materials fall into this. So a lot of things that you'll see at historic sites and your textbooks in your classroom as well. So here we have a few other examples. You'll notice maps here, interpretive materials from a park. We've got another painting, also of George Washington. This would not be a primary source because it was painted almost 100 years after the event that it's depicting. So it's just something to keep in mind and be careful of, that just because a source is a particular type of physical source, it doesn't mean that it's going to be primary or secondary automatically. And here we have a textbook at the top left, much like you'll use in your classrooms. So it's all a bit relative. A source can be both primary or secondary, depending on the subject or the topic that you're studying when you're using that source. So here is going to be an example of that. Here we have the death of Cleopatra and her royal ornaments. It's an etching that was made by Bartolomeo Pinelli in Rome in 1821. Cleopatra died over 2,000 years before this, so we know that it's not a primary source if we're studying her life. But if we are studying art from that time period or depictions of her death, then it would be primary instead of secondary. So now we are going to practice, and Brent is dropping a link in the chat. It's going to force you to make a copy of a Google slideshow. At the top of that slideshow, so maps that were made during a time period, that's a really great question. And so maps that were made during a time period can be primary or secondary. It depends on if you're doing, like if there was a survey that was being done and a person was physically there seeing those things and documenting it as they went, that would be primary. But sometimes you'll have maps that are secondary because it's a compilation of information from other sources. So then that's sort of a retelling or an analysis of that information. And in that case, it would be a secondary source. So you're going to sort these sources. I'm going to put you in breakout rooms, and there's 3 slides at the top: primary, secondary, and unsure, unknown, or both. And you're going to click and drag the sources into the appropriate categories. I'm going to give you all about 5 minutes to do this, and we're going to go ahead and throw you in those breakout rooms now.
Second, they were there.
Hi, everybody. Does it look like we got everybody back? Sometimes Microsoft is fun and likes to randomly kind of kick people out when we move between breakout rooms. So if that happens to you during the session, just rejoin with the link that you joined the webinar with originally. So did y'all notice anything? Was it easier than you thought? More challenging than you thought? See some people nodding. So
I found there were a few that I found a little challenging. Like I thought of newspapers as being primary sources, not secondary, especially if it was about an event from that time period. So that was new for me.
Okay. Yeah. So newspapers are like a really tricky one, because if you've got a firsthand account from somebody who is at an event, then of course it is primary. But if you've got a newspaper in Washington that is reporting on an event that happened in San Francisco and they weren't there, then you've got that distance of place, which then sort of makes it secondary. So there's a lot of finer elements that go into all this. So this is the way that I sorted these. Do you see anything that is the same as you, that is different? And you can drop that in the chat or come off mute, depending on what you're comfortable with.
See, I thought I questioned the map part, because
map?
if it was a time period map, I thought it would be more of a primary source from that time period.
Yeah, so I ended up categorizing it as secondary because it's information that they compiled, so it's an interpretation of that information. I'm seeing, wasn't sure about the political cartoon because they couldn't tell when it was created or referencing a past event. So what were you guys looking for when you were sorting these? What kinds of characteristics or traits were you looking for to make those determinations?
The time period, and when, if it could be backed up by facts, and who wrote it. Like obviously the War Department document came straight from the military, so I kind of looked at where it came from when I was looking at the primary or secondary.
Okay. So you're looking at the source descriptions. So things like if there was like an author name, if there was a date that it was created, maybe a place that it was created. These are things that I refer to as non-negotiables, right? These are the things we have to have in order to make those determinations. And these are things that I always like to recommend we give our students so that they have time to practice identifying that information, which is one of the very first parts of the skill of evidence, is the identification of information from a source. It's also great to model citations for your students when you're using sources, just so they get comfortable with seeing that, with doing that in their own work as they begin to incorporate those things as they start getting up into middle school. So you can sort of make your own determinations about what you deem essential in your classroom, but these are just some that I would recommend. All right. So the next section, we're going to start talking about purpose. How we talked about earlier, the focus can change whether it's primary or secondary. When you start selecting sources for use in your classroom, you have to have a focus and a purpose. So we're going to go through a process for this together really quickly. Could somebody drop in the chat or say out loud why we might go through these 3 steps before we start pulling sources? Yeah, relevance. So, and make sure that it's applicable. It's going to save you time because by the time you've done this, you know that it's aligned to standards. You know what you want your students to do with it. So you're not going to end up pulling sources that then you can't use. And it's going to help again with that alignment piece. So here I've selected indicator 4.2 CE, which is about the economic and political reasons that the colonists declared independence from Great Britain. You're going to pull some target content. These are things that you're going to end up searching for. Some, the related terminology that will help you when you actually begin your search. And then a skill statement. So since this is CE, I've gone to our handy dandy historical thinking progressions document, and I've gone into causation, and I want to identify multiple causes of a historical event because I know there are multiple reasons that we declared independence. And then I want my students to start thinking about how those events led to the events that followed. So how did all of these different things lead to us declaring independence? So then you're going to use a sentence stem and you're going to bring it together. So you've got your skill and your targeted content and concept. So I can identify multiple causes for the colonies declaring independence from Britain, which is going to be your task that you're going to have them do. And you've also got all of your target content already pre-pulled. So you have some search terms to start with when you get there. So Brent is now going to drop a link in the breakout group. I want you to select an indicator that you're currently using in your classroom or one that's coming up so that what you create is going to be relevant for you. And I want you to practice going through this process really quickly. Even though this is your personal copy, I do want you to go ahead and complete this because we're going to be coming back to this later in the session and using it when we get to a later step in this process. And again, I'm going to put y'all in breakout groups, so if you want to talk to each other, you can. Does everybody have the link? Can I get like a thumbs up reaction, or if y'all have it? No? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. All right, thank y'all so much. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move to breakout groups. So now we're going to move into breakout rooms, and y'all are going to have between 5 and 10 minutes. It's going to depend on how we're doing. I'll be popping in to check. Hi, everybody. Coming back. I think we might have lost 1 or 2 people, but we'll go along. All right, they're coming back in. All right, awesome. So if y'all will hold on to that document, we are going to come back to that later. There is a reason that we filled that out, and we'll be coming back to that shortly. So thank y'all for taking some time to fill that out. So before we get into actually pulling our sources, here are some different considerations. Different source types are going to be best for different learners at different ages. Here are some general recommendations for different grade levels. If you notice, the sources in earlier grades are less text heavy, a little bit more visual or audible, things that students can relate to a bit more easily. Then as we go up in grade levels, we'll start adding a little bit more text and a little bit more complexity as we go. This will be in a set of handouts that you will receive shortly. Don't worry if we didn't get to read everything. I believe this is where Brent will send the link to those handouts. I'm going to ask that you don't read through those now. It's just for you to have and to reference if you need to as we go on through the session. And it will be a force copy link through Google as well. I can get a thumbs up when y'all got it. And then we'll move on. All right, cool. I'm seeing some thumbs. All right. So now we're going to move in. And one question that I get, all right, Julie, thank you, is where to find age-appropriate sources. And there are a multitude of places that you can look. My personal favorites for K-5 are the Library of Congress because they've got really easy to use and state-specific collections. So they have things that are specific to South Carolina. They make it really easy to pull visual sources, and they also include the citations down at the bottom. So that's right there for you. Know It All has some really great secondary sources, just like SC Discus. In SC Discus, there is a specific database called historical reference source. And there's some pre-pulled sources in there that are great as well. Local libraries are really good resources, especially if you're in K2, because local librarians know local history and can point you in the direction for sources that would be relevant to your area. And that's going to vary depending on where you are in the state based off of those standards being community-based. Text-based sources, especially primary sources, are not always going to be readily available in a form that is developmentally appropriate for K-5. So one thing that I like to remind people of is you need to find a source that's a good resource that is aligned and then adapt it. Because as we saw earlier, there was a couple of you that said you found a perfect source and then realized that you were still going to have to change it after spending a lot of time doing that. So find a source that's aligned, that is a good example that your students can do the activity with, and then adapt it. And we're going to talk about how to do that shortly. So in the two images that are on your screen right now, what do you notice in the image on the left? What immediately jumps out to you? It's black and white. Yeah, there's text.
Looks
down
like
at the
someone's
bottom.
holding a flashlight during a time flashlights didn't exist.
Yeah. Hard to see, looks older. So we've got people, a whole bunch of figures, and they're all dressed kind of funny. We've got something that looks like it's exploding in the background. We've got this guy with a flashlight when flashlights didn't exist, and text that's at the bottom that we can't really read. So yeah, the left is harder to see that moment is being depicted. So that's what we notice on the left. What about the image on the right? It's much clearer. There's a focus point, more visible. What do you see in the painting that your students would pick out? So recognizable people. So we see George Washington very clearly. Got an American flag. We've got ice. So we've got some environmental factors that students can relate to. Maybe it's cold. It looks like everybody's wearing fur hats and long coats, rough waters. Yeah. So there's all these different things that our students can see and relate to. I'm also going to point out the horses in the back because I don't know about y'all, but my students would get very excited if there was horses. And I also like horses. So possibly related to a voyage is what your students would say. Yes, horses on boats. I would not want to be on a boat with a horse. I don't know about y'all. It doesn't seem like it'd be good, especially as low as those are to the water. So of these two sources, which one of these would you pick to use in your classroom and why? Somebody said the second one. They'd be able to explain it better. Right. So when we're selecting images to use in our classrooms, we need to select things that our students are going to be able to relate to. That can be environmental factors. It can be very clear images of people. Sometimes when you're using primary sources, especially if you're pulling from a database, the scans aren't always clear. So that is something you have to be aware of. And also the image on the left is great. It's a great period image. But the problem is it's not legible. The text is in German. We can't read German. It's also in script. And there's a lot of layered symbolism, which would result in a very heavy cognitive load because students would have to remember what all of the different things represent because it's things that they're not familiar with. So those are some of the things that we keep in mind when we select sources. So for the next activity, we're going to go through really rapid, and I want you to use the reactions that we talked about that's in the bar at the top and give me a thumbs up if you would use it in your classroom, and give me clapping hands if you would not use it in your classroom, because we don't have a thumbs down reaction. Y'all ready? All right, so first image. I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs up. Why would you use this image? If you could drop it in the chat or come off mute. I'm seeing a ton of thumbs up. I saw somebody say no. Yeah, so you see skull and crossbones, right? That's something that'll catch your students' attention and something they can relate to. They know that it's not good. So this would be a really great source to use about the Stamp Act in a fourth grade classroom. Yeah, it's hard to read. So that would be a good reason not to if you didn't want to because of that down at the bottom. You can also crop it so that you keep the focus at the top. And one thing that I like to do when I'm using sources like this is to provide like a typed version of the text. It's also really helpful if you've got anything in script as well. Oh yeah, I've got some excellent things that you're putting in the chat. All right, so we're going to move to the next source. It would be great for the four corner strategy. Yes. All right. What about this one? See a thumbs up. All right. Seeing several thumbs up and somebody said no. Why would this be good or bad? Yeah, it depends on how well they know context. They would relate to the comical aspect. Yeah. And it's a very clear image, right? You can tell everybody else, yeah, probably for 5th or 6th grade. I actually pulled this for as a 5th grade source, 5th grade example. And this is in the Library of Congress, so it's easy to pull if you're a 5th grade teacher, by the way. So it's very clear. There's some symbolism, but not too much. You could easily label these to individuals, sort of lower that cognitive load and make it more accessible if your students are lacking some of that context. So it would be great for students to talk about and analyze, as Noah's saying. Yeah, so it's a good one. All right, so what about this third one? All right, I'm seeing a no. Seeing a couple of no's. Yes, a couple of no's. No. Okay, why would this maybe not be great to use in a K-5 classroom? Yeah, it's great for high school. As far as global involvement and fears that people had during the Civil War. Yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of representations. It's a very heavy cognitive load when it comes to interpreting because there's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot going on. Also, there's some violence going on there in the background that we might not want to expose young students to, and it's not relatable. Yes. So a lot of it is dependent, again, upon what grade you're teaching, and that's just some things to keep in mind when you're selecting images. So when it comes to selecting text, you always are going to want to choose text that can be chunked really easy if you're teaching elementary, just because that can make things a little bit more accessible or simple to adjust, save you time, shorter in length, that have terms that are easily recognizable or terms that students are going to use later. This is a great vocabulary builder when you're using primary sources in elementary. You do have to be careful about period language. Make sure that any text you have that's in script is transcribed. I have had to actually go through and like transcribe things myself because you can't always find transcriptions of sources. And then I would encourage you to use what's available. Your districts, some districts have pre-pulled resources that are fantastic. Discus has great resources. Your textbooks, some of our textbooks have pre-pulled primary sources that are in there transcribed or are made accessible for students of elementary age. So those are all places you can look that things are already readily available for you where you don't have to go search and adapt. Here I have two examples of text that you could use. One is the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, you're not going to use the Declaration of Independence in its entirety, and you're going to have to use some of these different steps in adapting it because you're going to have to make sure it's not in script and make sure that you've got language that's not always period. But we've also got a diary entry from George Washington describing the weather. That's something that is relatable for students. They're all relatively short entries, and it's a great crossover with science if you also teach science to sort of bring primary sources into your other content areas. So this is an example of that cross-curricular connection that we can make. So we're going to play yay or nay again. So thumbs up for yes, clapping for no. Is this something that you think you could use in your classroom? Seeing some people clapping and saying no. I'm seeing some people saying yes. I'm seeing a lot of no's. Why would you say no? Incorrect grammar. So you will encounter in primary sources, sometimes things are incorrect. I think that it is great to show students that people aren't perfect and always haven't been perfect. I know it would have made me feel better about my spelling and grammar when I was in school. And also period language is different. So sometimes exposing students to that will help them in later grades because they start getting used to the fact that people used to write and speak differently. So this is a letter that a little girl wrote to Abraham Lincoln when he was running for president. Personally, I would recommend, yes, and to show a child's writing to the kids. Exactly. This is something that would be relatable for students. And you don't have to give them the whole thing. You can break it into smaller pieces and pull what's relevant. But this would be a good type of source that you could use. So don't discount something just based off of links. Base it off of relevancy and whether your students can relate. Okay, the next one. See somebody saying no. A couple people saying yes. For younger grades. Yes. I see a couple of people typing as far as why they would or would not. And for teaching context. Yeah, so this is relatively short. There's a lot of vocabulary that would need to be taught, so you would have to provide some support and some scaffolding. But this is a really great example of people's perspectives or what different groups were experiencing at that time. See a lot of vocabulary that would need to be taught. Yeah, so that period language can be a challenge, but with support. Comparing one previous with the other one be good point of view for the time period, as well as language and vocabulary time. Yes. Okay, so this next one should be pretty quick as far as yes or no, and then we're going to move on. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of immediate no's, a lot of really heavy period language, a lot of difficult vocabulary. It's a very lengthy source, and it's, yeah, so it'd be too challenging. We wouldn't want to use this in our classroom. All right, so I'm just very quickly going to walk you through a few of the sources that are available at the Library of Congress that you might find useful. So if you go to the Teachers tab on their homepage, they've got a variety of different resources available to you. At the top, I want to point out they've got classroom materials that are at the ready. They offer professional development sessions on using their collections, and we're specifically going to focus today on getting started with primary sources. So if you go to this Finding Primary Sources tab, there are a ton of ready-made resources, and we're actually going to very quickly go into breakout rooms and look at these. So we're going to send the links now, and then we'll send the links out again in an announcement when we get into those breakout rooms. So group 1 is going to look at primary source sets. These are pre-pulled resources that have already been curated for you on a variety of topics. Same with free to use and reuse. These are batches of images. I think they're especially great for lower elementary. U.S. History Primary Sources Timeline. It's got some pre-pulled resources and also descriptions of time period and the context of what was happening during those periods, as well as the Teaching with the Library of Congress blog, which is a great resource as well. They actually have resident teachers who come in and pull sources and put together with classroom lessons. So we're going to go ahead and move into breakout groups. You're going to have about 2 to 3 minutes to explore this with your group, and then we'll come back together. Have one thing that you notice from your section ready to share when we come back. All right, so if y'all could drop in the chat what your one thing you noticed about your resource that you explored was. Like, what was one thing you would tell another teacher about from the source that you explored? You can drop it in the chat or you can come off mute. It says very organized, categorized by time period, author for the blog, state-oriented primary sources, great background info, if you're knowledgeable there. Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use the resources that the Library of Congress has, and that's why I like to recommend it to people, especially if you're a newer teacher or you want to start incorporating more. It's a really great jump-off point for people who are just starting to pull those primary and secondary sources themselves. So now we're all going to search together for sources related to that document that we filled out earlier. So we're going to go to http://www.loc.gov. Brent, I think, is also going to drop that in the chat so that you don't have to type in the web address if you're like me and you don't want to. So we're going to navigate there together. And then up at the top right, there's a search bar, and you're going to search everything. And this is where some of those key terms that you pulled out for your content earlier in step 2, this is where you would input 1 or 2 of those terms. So for me, I input American Revolution. And what it looks like when you search is this that's on my screen right now. You've got all of your categories for filters on the left. If you are an elementary teacher, which I'm assuming if you're here, you are, I recommend specifically filtering by photo, print, drawing, map, audio recording, or even 3D object. That's a little bit further down, just because those are some of those more visual-based sources that'll be easier for your students. And also, if you pull a book or printed material, when you open that, it pulls the entire book and you have to flip through page by page, which is not always the easiest. It can be a real-time sync for you. You'll notice at the top, we've got some collections instead of actual resources. I encourage you to dive into any collections that show up in your search because, again, that's those pre-curated resources that are pulled. Sometimes they have teacher guides attached, and so that's all related information. So now we're going to actually search the Library of Congress for resources that are aligned to our graphic organizer that we filled out earlier. So they'll be aligned to our indicator that we selected. We know what kind of task we want our students to do with it. So using keywords, time periods, titles, topics, all these different things, we're going to search for sources that are relevant. So Brent is going to drop another link in the chat. And this link is to a Google Slides. And what I would like you to do is fill out a slide with your indicator that you selected, your skill that you selected, and then if you find a source, drop the link to that source. And what I'm going to do at the end of today is I'm going to pull everything that everybody has selected and put that into a document that's linked in the handouts you got earlier. So you hopefully will have access to several different sources that are aligned to different indicators for use in your classroom. So are we good? Do we have any questions? Thumbs up, thumbs down. All good. Okay. So we're going to take about 10 minutes for this. And if you don't find something, that's okay. You won't always find the perfect thing. But this is just an exercise to get you familiar with searching the database and pulling sources that are aligned. I'm going to open breakout rooms just so y'all can have some discussion if you'd like to as you look. Like I said, we'll come back in about 10 minutes. All right, so I was looking at, it looks like we have a couple of sources that were in the PowerPoint, so I'll be moving those over into that document so y'all can access them later. Sometimes if you're a fifth grade teacher, you may have a harder time in Library of Congress, and I meant to warn y'all about this earlier. Just with the kind of the time period cut off and when copyright kicks in, it can be harder to find more recent sources, more recent primary sources in that database that are free to use just by the nature of copyright law. But it's really great if you're a fourth grade teacher or if you're doing some more general stuff with like American symbolism and major historical events in second grade. Alrighty. Oh, I gotta share my screen. We're gonna move along. Thank y'all for sticking with me. I know this is a lot. All right. So now we're going to talk really quickly about adapting sources. And I want to know how you adapt sources that you're already using in your classroom. Maybe it's not a primary or secondary source. It can be in another subject area, videos, your textbook. What are some things that you think about when you're selecting what resources you're using in your classroom? Right, cater to everyone, different levels, they can understand, age appropriate language. So a lot of those same things are going to apply here, especially with how you adapt resources for use. So those are all considerations that you'll make. I'll come back to your question in a little while, Matt. So just some quick tips for adaptation. Be creative with your source types. You're not limited to just photos or text. Using audio is great. The Library of Congress has a collection called the National Jukebox. It has audio recordings going back to the late 1800s, which is really great for use in classrooms. Limit the number of sources you're providing your students. So maybe about 3 at a time maximum if you're in 4th or 5th grade, and 1 or 2 if you're in lower grades, just to reduce that cognitive load so that your students can truly engage with the content that you're giving them. Students like to ask a lot of questions. Lean into that curiosity and observation because that's going to be their strength when working with primary sources. As we talked about earlier, chunk text, and then also pair primary and secondary sources because secondary sources can provide more context and also make primary sources a little bit more accessible. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I don't want you to read the whole slide, but just really quickly, how does this make you feel? Looking at this slide. Overwhelmed. Yes. So that is how our students can feel, of course, when we give them text-based sources, especially even if it's shorter and it's just words they don't recognize. Overwhelmed, too many words. Yes. So what about this slide? Better. Does it feel a little bit more manageable? Okay. So what do you, easier to comprehend, visually nicer, they see the vocab? Yeah. Okay, so what do you notice? This is a piece of text from that last slide that we looked at. What are some of the strategies? I think a couple of you have named a few that we see used to adapt this so that it's a little bit more accessible for our students. Shortened, simplified. Yeah, so it's chunked, vocab feature. And what do you notice about the vocabulary that we strategically left? Are there any words in there? If we're teaching the Declaration of Independence, this is going to be early in a 4th grade course. Cutting away the unnecessary bits. See somebody typing, so I'll let them respond. Abolish is something that they will hear again and again. Exactly right. So you can use primary sources by strategically leaving vocabulary to build your students' vocabulary earlier in the school year, so that as they continue throughout the school year, they become more familiar with those terms, and you have to provide less scaffolding later. And they're relevant for time period and document further. Yes. So these are all things you can do. You can replace words, you can remove extraneous text, you can chunk it. And so you can teach documents that are complex or are lengthy. You just have to make some slight tweaks that make them more accessible for your students. So normally we would take some time and practice this here. Brent's going to send the link for you to make a copy if you would like to. There's about 6 different texts that are included in this for you to practice on if you would like, and there's 3 different levels, so you can sort of choose your difficulty. Yeah, put a picture to the word when doing vocabulary overview helps your students. Yeah, that's a great strategy. So we're not going to do this today, but if you want a copy to practice with later, you can make a copy. So these are some more comments that I've received in the past about ML students and lower students and tiered supports. So questions that I like to tell people to ask themselves are, what is your learning target? So what is at the heart of what you're trying to get at? What are you really assessing? And what is really essential for your students to reach that target? So if you're looking at a political cartoon of King George, is it important that they know that's King George by looking at it? Or is that a label you could provide that would take some of that off your students when they're interpreting it, so that then they can understand the cartoon a little bit easier? When you start considering those things, it allows you to provide additional supports like translated captions and descriptions, so that they have some additional context in their native language. Dual language sentence stems to help stimulate discussion, and as well as clear labels for things that are in these images. If you're using an image that might be unclear, so maybe labeling people's names, like we were talking about with King George, that would make it easier for students to interpret as well. So moving along, I mentioned pairing resources. Pairing a primary source with a secondary source can make it more accessible to students. So if we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, there's a really great book from Penguin Books that talks about the Declaration of Independence in a way that's a little bit more accessible to students. And you can do this by pairing children's books, paintings, videos, all kinds of things. And by strategically pairing resources, you can actually bring in more of the historical thinking skills. So here, if you will read on your screen, we have an excerpt from a letter from Robert Morris to Joseph Reed in 1776. And then a letter from John Adams to Abigail Adams, also that same month in 1776. What do you notice about these 2 sources side by side? Expressing opposite opinions, yes. So here we have the skill of comparison, where you can see differing perspectives on an issue, and you can show that to students through using primary sources from the period. Wording from the same year. So both of these were written around the signing of the Declaration. Here we have 2 more. We have the Tea Act and then an etching of the destruction of tea in Boston Harbor. What do we notice about these 2 sources side by side if we're looking at them together? Yeah, it's causation, it's cause and effect. So we can use primary and secondary sources in our classrooms to practice those skills. And if you wanted to add a 3rd one, you could even start getting into contextualization by sandwiching things between events or periodization. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. With mapping activities, you can actually embed through Google Earth primary sources into a map so that students can interact with things in geographic space. And then just really quickly, some cross-curricular activities you can do using historical context. Like the dolls, there's an advertisement here from 1886. You could attach prices to those and in a math class have students add or subtract to fit within a certain budget what toys they would buy, but it also allows them to make a historical connection to children living at that time. Letters, one time I received a question asking if we can use primary sources to teach handwriting from an ELA teacher. My recommendation is we aren't going to use it to teach cursive, but we can use it to practice cursive, just because historical script can be very difficult to read. So writing letters, you can use primary sources as a stimulus in ELA. So all content sort of ties back to social studies and that everything we do as humans is connected to something in our past. So there's a lot of opportunities for connections and cross-curricular interest here. Really quickly, Brent's going to send a link to the Library of Congress analysis tool. They actually have different sets of questions that you can use based on the source type. I think that this can be used K through 5. You might have to adapt your questions a little bit, you know, your students, but it's a really great thinking tool for teachers in how to approach different types of primary sources in their classrooms. So it's just a good resource to have, and that's also linked in the handout that you received earlier. You can create investigations using primary sources, have students create posters if you're doing like World War I or World War II, artifact creation and puzzles. So there's lots of different ways that you can use primary sources. Earlier, somebody mentioned the four boxes with images, and that's where you cover an image, like you divide it into 4 quadrants and you reveal 1 quadrant at a time and make observations about each piece. So it helps students more closely interact with that source. And that's what you can kind of do with a puzzle as well, is cut up visual primary source, give it to your students, each one analyze their little piece, and then see how it all fits together and talk about that greater context. So we're going to skip our reflection today. And congratulations, you've made it to the end. So we're going to now send our link to our feedback form. You have to fill out this feedback form in order to get your recertification credit. Again, thank you all so much for coming today. If you have any additional questions, please email me. I'm always happy to support. And I will get those certificates out to you shortly. I'm going to stop the recording now.